Okay. We're going, right? All right, hi everybody. Welcome to the STS seminar here at Virginia Tech. My name is Lee Vinsel. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society. I, along with my colleague Sonia Schmidt and our trusty graduate assistant Oliver Schuetz, organized the department's seminar this year. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today, Jenny Schuetz. But before I do that, I wanted to take a moment to thank the staff members here at Virginia Tech, the Virginia Tech Athenaeum, for all their help and work improving the quality of our stream this semester, including broadcasting the seminar on YouTube. Athenaeum Director Joe Fort and production assistants Mandy Lamb and Caleb Perdue have put a lot of work into this, and we couldn't do it without them, so thank you all. The talk today by Jenny is related to a graduate seminar I'm teaching this semester called Communicating Academic Ideas to Non-Academic Audiences. The class builds on a proud tradition in this department going back to the 1980s called Choices and Challenges, which was created by Professor Doris Zahlen. Choices and Challenges focused on bringing together experts and lay community members in the spirit of democratic deliberation to talk through complex moral, political, and social issues around science, technology, and medicine. One of my goals with Choices and Challenges has been to shift it a bit away from emerging technologies that may or may not come to have real social effects to actual human suffering happening this minute. And I could think of no better way to do that than to focus on the housing crises which are currently rampant throughout the nation, to say nothing of the globe. As I was looking into how to teach this class and get students up to speed on housing issues, I was repeatedly told by people there's no better way to start than Jenny Schuetz's 2022 book, Fixer Upper: How to Repair America's Broken Housing System. And so here we are today. Jenny Schuetz is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Before moving to Brookings, she worked for a little organization called the Federal Reserve. And before that, she was a professor at the University of Southern California. She has a PhD in public policy from Harvard University. And what I did not know before I invited her is that she grew up here in little Blacksburg, Virginia. So she actually, and her parents still, and I think brother, still live here. So she actually knows something about the local housing situation. Here's how today is going to work. Jenny's going to talk a bit about her book and also talk about her work communicating ideas to non-academic audiences, because that's what she does for a living. And then we're going to have a first response from the gentleman sitting next to me right here, Freddy Page, who's Assistant Director of the Virginia Center for Housing Research, and he has a background in civil engineering. Freddy works in Nova, but we're lucky to have him here in person today because he also co-runs Virginia Tech's Hip Hop Club, and they had an event last night. And I also wanted to mention in passing that Freddy will also be talking about his own work in this seminar next semester. So I'm also hoping Freddy's colleague in the Housing Research Center, Mel Jones, might show up a bit later. So Jenny's going to talk, Freddy's going to give a first cut and offer some thoughts and questions. Then we'll open up to Q&A. Students in the class came up with a list of questions, so I'm hoping some of them will ask questions. We'll see if they're brave enough, and we'll just do general Q&A, and that will be the seminar today. So Jenny, take it away, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me. I always love a chance to talk about my book with people who are interested in housing, and of course it's particularly special to talk with a bunch of people who are located in Blacksburg, Virginia. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oops, looks like I don't have permission.
Oliver will help you with that. Sorry about that, Jenny.
No worries. All right. You guys all see my slides? Yes.
We sure can, yes.
Excellent. All right. So the book came out about 1.5 years ago, and it feels particularly appropriate to share with you guys, given the focus of your class. This is my attempt to wrap up a bunch of big ideas that have been floating around in my head for a long time and put it into a digestible form for non-technical audiences. So if you've been paying attention to what's been going on in housing markets, you may find this slogan familiar. This is Jimmy McMillan. He has run a number of times both for governor of New York and I believe for some of the citywide races. He is the head and possibly the only member of the Rent is Too Damn High party. So New York has had obviously very high housing costs for a very long time. You can see the date of this screenshot from YouTube. This is a 2010 campaign. So New Yorkers have been dealing with expensive housing for a very long time. But this has become a more and more salient issue in lots of parts of the US. If we want to think about kind of the longer term historical perspective, housing production relative to the growth of population size has been going down for several decades. So going back to about 1970, we build less housing each year relative to the size of the existing population than we used to. And that's been trending downwards with some sort of up and down cycles for business cycles. The most immediate problem started with the Great Recession. We stopped building homes altogether for about 4 or 5 years. People couldn't get loans to buy homes. Builders couldn't get loans to build homes. There was a glut of vacant housing and very low demand. And so we just stopped building altogether. It took quite a while to dig ourselves back out to the levels of production we were at before the crisis. And so nationally, we have about 3.8 fewer homes than we need. This is just to keep up with the demand created by population growth and job growth. And of course, where you live in the country matters. The housing shortage in places like California, Seattle, Boston, New York goes back really to about 30 or 40 years. The places that have really strong job markets, some of the most productive companies in the world, and some of the highest paid jobs haven't been building enough homes for much longer. In parts of the country like Nashville and Austin and Denver, we are just starting to see demand outstripping supply in ways that make people nervous about the future affordability of those regions. Now, it's important to distinguish between what housing markets would build if they were allowed to build, and the regulations and policies that we have chosen to impose on ourselves around housing development. So local governments are the entities in the US that control housing production. You can't build a home on a piece of land without going to your local government, applying for a building permit, and being issued it. Local governments have chosen to create a whole set of layers of regulations and policies that make it quite hard to build. And in particular, we've set aside most of the land in this country for single-family detached homes with yards. That means it's illegal to build a duplex or a row house or an apartment building on the majority of land in the country. Now, living in a place like Blacksburg, that may not seem so crazy. A lot of the town is single-family and apartments are clustered around campus. But these patterns of land use are also true in big cities. Where I live in Washington, D.C., more than half of the land is set aside only for single-family homes, even though this is a big city with expensive land, and you would think that it would be natural to build apartments and row houses in more places. So we can look at some of the examples of things that used to be legal pre-zoning and currently are illegal. This picture I took in the Fan District in Richmond, which some of you may be familiar with. If you walk through the neighborhood, you'll see some single-family homes, some row houses, but a lot of buildings that look like this. This is a sixplex, 6 apartments stacked on top of one another. Fourplexes are also very common in the Fan. We used to build these essentially the way we build detached single-family homes, just churning out one after the other on relatively similar floor plans, but there's just a lot of stock available that we built before zoning made this illegal. Much of the Northeast Corridor, we're very familiar with row house neighborhoods. So in places like Baltimore and Philly in particular, you have these really skinny row houses. This is a very efficient way to get a lot of homes on a small piece of land. This works well both for homeownership and for rentals. This is a very versatile structure type, but guess what? These are illegal to build on most parts of the country. We also used to be much better at building a combination of neighborhood serving retail, like restaurants and coffee shops, on the ground floor and then building apartments on top of it. One of the advantages of this is that people are able to run a lot of their day-to-day errands without having to drive, that you can simply walk downstairs, pick up a coffee, drop off your dry cleaning, hop on the bus and head off to your job. So this is in San Diego. This is not just an older East Coast phenomenon. all parts of the country have examples of this mixture of retail and housing built in together, which again is illegal under current zoning in most parts of the US. Building after zoning became popular between about the 1920s and 1940s, and so most communities that were built after the 1940s look pretty much like this. This is actually a newer subdivision, but you can see the standards and the sort of uniform dimensions imposed on housing. This is in fact what zoning is supposed to do. It sets out standards for new home building, including the size of the lot, the piece of land you can build on. That has to be identical size. The houses are all the same size, same height, same distance setback from the street, from one another on the sides. They're required to have off-street parking, in this case, a two-car garage for every house. And from an aerial view, this turns into a bunch of neighborhoods that look absolutely identical. The houses are built at the same time, the same size, the same dimensions, out of the same materials. And this also enforces a uniformity of the people who live in the community. Because these all are owner-occupied and sell for the same price, in order to live in this community and partake of the amenities nearby, you have to be able to buy a house of a certain price point. You have to be able to come up with a down payment, qualify for a mortgage, and make the monthly mortgage payments. Because there is such a strong correlation in the US between income and race and ethnicity, this means we also get neighborhoods that are very segregated, not only by income, but also by race. And so zoning is one of the ways that we maintain these existing social patterns. I've talked so far about some of the rules written down on paper, prohibitions of certain structure types, minimum lot sizes, height limits. Those are important components of zoning that restrict the ability to build more housing, and especially to build more diverse housing. But it's also important to understand that this is very much a political process. Local governments decide what housing development to approve and what to deny. And local governments have themselves deferred heavily to people who already live in the community, particularly longtime homeowners who tend to be very politically active. So a typical way that the development process works, a developer might propose building an apartment building on top of a service parking lot. Before they can get approval to do that, there will be a series of community meetings where people can come out on a Tuesday evening and stand up and say, I don't like the apartment building. It's too tall. It's out of keeping with neighborhood character. What's going to happen to traffic? This will bring in more people to our community, or this will bring in different people to our community. In effect, local governments have given existing residents veto power over any new development that they don't like. And it turns out that very often existing residents don't want any new development or any changes in their existing neighborhood. It's understandable that people care about the places they live. We get very attached to our communities. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but giving longtime, relatively affluent, older homeowners veto power over change has big social, economic, and environmental costs that the rest of us wind up bearing. And so we see particularly that younger households who are more likely to be renters and have less savings have a very difficult time moving into communities that have great public schools and access to jobs and transportation, that existing residents essentially gatekeep people who are not like themselves. So far, I've been talking about restrictions on development, which leads to overall higher housing prices and rents through a scarcity mechanism. We haven't built enough homes to keep up with demand. There's a separate affordability problem that we want to think about a little bit differently, and that's specific to the poorest 20 to 25% of households everywhere in the country. Poor people can't afford to pay for market rate housing, minimum quality housing, unless we give them additional money. And this is really an income problem. We can tell this by looking at some of the geographic differences. Even in places like Baltimore and St. Louis, where there are a lot of vacant homes, there's objectively more housing than people to consume it, and housing costs are relatively low. Even there, poor households spend more than half of their income every month on the rent or the mortgage, which leaves them too little money left over to pay for things like food and transportation and healthcare. Because this is primarily an income problem, the solution is to give poor people more money as directly as possible. We have a number of policies already that do this. So things like the Earned Income Tax Credit provide annual refunds to low-income households. Our biggest housing subsidy program, vouchers, gives essentially the federal government picks up part of the tab for people's rent. But we don't give these programs to most people who qualify. Only about 1 in 4 low-income households gets any kind of housing subsidy from the federal government. So there's just an awful lot of people who wind up not being able to afford decent quality housing without making really big compromises in other kinds of necessities. The flip side of not building enough homes in places where people want to live is that we have built and continue to build too many homes in the wrong places from a climate perspective. If you have at all been following news over the last couple of months in insurance markets, you'll have an idea of what this means. We have built a lot of homes in, for instance, coastal Florida, in parts of the Mountain West that year after year are at high risk of wildfires, places that flood repeatedly. So we have built a lot of homes in places that are at very high risk of climate damage. That will only get worse going forward. And this is something that we are all paying for already, both through taxpayer subsidies for disaster recovery programs. And frankly, if you live in a low climate risk place, your insurance premium is going to subsidize people who live in riskier places. So these costs are going to continue to grow. They're unavoidable. And we have to make decisions about building homes in safe places and limiting future development in risky places. The U.S. has relied heavily on homeownership as the primary mechanism of wealth building. So the idea is that you buy a house with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Every month you pay down the mortgage. Some of that is interest that goes to the bank and they keep, and some of that goes into the equity that you're building up for the house. So even if the home doesn't appreciate in value by very much, you build up savings over time by paying down the mortgage. And that becomes then a nest egg that people can tap into, whether to take out a home equity loan, to do repairs, to start a small business, to borrow to send their kids to college, or to pay for retirement. This is a great mechanism for people who have access to homeownership and can buy into the latter relatively early in their life. But we also know that the U.S. has had a long history of excluding Black households in particular, and to a lesser extent, Latino households, who were not able to gain access to homeownership. Until the 1968 Fair Housing Act, that was actually legal. Banks could just not give loans to Black households because they were Black, and that was okay. Now that's illegal to discriminate, but there's still a very wide disparity in homeownership rates as well as in home equity. So more than 70% of white households own their own home. Fewer than half of Black and Latino households do. And this graph shows that even when you just look at homeowner households, white households have more than twice the home equity that Black and Latino households do. Zoning also reinforces our existing patterns of racial and economic segregation. Zoning didn't create most of these patterns. This is showing you a map of redlining in the city of Richmond. We know that there have been a lot of policy tools that don't exist anymore, but then in previous decades were used to create racial segregation, to limit particularly high opportunity neighborhoods so that Black and Latino households could not move in. Zoning is only one of the more recent forms. And it's a really sneaky form of segregation because there's nothing in your zoning law that says that Black and Latino households can't buy a home in an affluent white neighborhood. It just uses the mechanism of you have to be able to come up with a down payment to pay for a very expensive house to live there. We're not discriminating against Black households as long as they can afford to buy $1 million house. And so it becomes much harder to challenge zoning on fair housing grounds. Local governments are not disinterested players in the housing development game. Local governments rely very heavily on property taxes to pay for things like K-12 schools, public safety, transportation, parks, libraries. And because local governments rely on these taxes, they're very conscious of the value of homes that are built in their community. So the simple calculation goes, if I allow expensive, large single-family homes, a 1% property tax will bring in more revenue per house than if I allow an apartment building with studio apartments where each unit is worth less and therefore generates a lower revenue. One of the sort of tricky things here is that large single-family homes disproportionately attract families with kids who go to school and therefore increase the demands on school spending, whereas smaller apartments typically are occupied by either younger households without children or older households whose kids no longer live with them, and so actually wind up being less of a demand on public resources. But there's a very strong belief by many local governments that, in fact, apartments do not pay for themselves in the way that expensive homes do. Overly restrictive zoning that's adopted by local governments, often at the neighborhood level, has broader economic impacts that affect neighboring communities, states, regions, and in fact, the entire national economy. So we have at this point pretty substantial research that shows that because places like California that have these really productive companies don't build enough homes, that actually slows down the overall national level of growth. In essence, people who should be moving to the Bay Area and starting up new companies and benefiting from access to venture capital and existing knowledge, people don't move there and they don't start companies, and we have fewer jobs and less wealth as an entire country because of these restrictions. As the recognition grows of these larger economic impacts, we are getting more pushback from state governments and even in some sense from the federal government that this is a problem nationally and we're going to need some national solutions to fix it. In order to correct all of these problems that I've been laying out to you, we're going to need systemic policy changes at all levels of government. Local governments who write the rules around housing production need to change those rules and allow a greater diversity of housing types at a wider range of prices. So not just owner-occupied single-family apartments, missing middle housing like duplexes and ADUs and row houses for rent, for ownership, and at a range of prices and rents that can accommodate households at a much wider range of incomes. State governments have several really important roles to play. They create the legal environment in which local governments operate. In essence, states had the authority to regulate land use and development. They devolve that to local governments, but they can also take it back, or at the very least put up guardrails that limit local governments from being able to ban certain structure types or make it easier to build higher density housing in strategic locations like around transit or close to job centers. State governments can also help local governments offset the impacts on their local revenues when new housing gets built. So for instance, providing funds for water and sewer infrastructure or for K through 12 schools that make it easier for local governments to say yes to additional housing. The federal government has very limited legal authority over land use and housing supply. The best thing that the federal government could do would be to expand the financial support that we give to low-income households, whether that's making housing vouchers an entitlement for all poor households, returning to a monthly child tax credit that all families with kids would get. We have a variety of different policy mechanisms, but simply get more cash into the hands of poor families. The policy solutions that I put in my book are not original ideas that I came up with myself. Many of these have actually been circulating among researchers and advocacy groups for decades. The problem is the politics to changing the status quo is, as my friends in Boston would say, wicked hard. We have deeply entrenched interests, particularly the sort of typical suburban homeowner household, who believes that the current system is benefiting them and doesn't really want to see changes. Many of the groups who would benefit the most from expanding housing supply and reducing housing costs are younger households, renter households, and a more racially and ethnically diverse coalition. But these are also groups that tend not to vote at the same kind of rate as older households do. And so their voice is simply not being heard in the political process, or when it does, tends to get drowned out by a couple of squeaky wheel homeowners who show up at every community meeting and write letters to the editor nonstop. I like to end on a note of optimism. Despite all of the sort of political headwinds against housing supply, there's actually a lot of movement in the last couple of years that suggests that we are starting to see some meaningful changes. Two things in particular. There's been an extraordinary growth of locally based pro-housing groups. Some of them call themselves YIMBYs, for Yes in My Backyard. Others avoid that term, but groups that are advocating for regulations that would allow more housing, more responsive supply to demand, and a greater diversity of housing options. Most of these are organized at the local or even neighborhood level, but we are also seeing some groups emerge at the state and national level as well. And they're putting pressure on their elected officials saying, you really need to be building more apartments so people can afford to live here. Just a selection of the places where these show up. I don't think Blacksburg has a YIMBY chapter yet. There's a group in Charlottesville called Livable Charlottesville, the DC area, Richmond, and then you can see across the country there are a number of groups that are organizing in support of more housing. The other promising trend is that state lawmakers are starting to notice the economic costs of not building enough homes. States like Virginia, that traditionally have been pretty affordable, are worried about losing big employers to cheaper places. If companies can't hire and retain workers, they will go elsewhere. And so as Virginia becomes more expensive, particularly in the Northern Virginia area, but also in areas like Norfolk, around Richmond, even in Blacksburg and Charlottesville, there's increasing difficulty in keeping people there because of housing costs. And so state lawmakers are starting to push back, limit the zoning autonomy of local governments, or provide direct subsidies to build more affordable housing. So the book is an attempt to kind of tie all of this together and present a coherent housing policy package. Helping people understand the ways in which different policies interact was one of my key themes. Understanding that things like zoning, federal tax incentives for home ownership, local funding of infrastructure, all of these wind up reinforcing one another, which makes it very complicated just to change one piece of the problem and have the other pieces stay there. So for instance, if we gave people more wealth building options outside of homeownership, there would be less opposition or less reason for homeowners to worry about new developments that they think might bring down property values or slow appreciation. So this intersection of different policies is important for people to understand before we start developing the kinds of solutions that both will work in terms of policy and also building political support for it. So I offered to give a couple of quick slides and notes about how I think about talking with a larger audience. The book is the first one that I have written, and I will say that writing a whole book is very different from writing articles or short pieces, but a lot of the sort of thought process of how to write blog posts for general audience actually do translate even to longer works, except for the first one. So when I sit down to write things for Brookings' website, one of the first things I decide is how long am I going to spend on this? Attention spans are short. You are competing for eyeballs with all kinds of news. It's very hard actually to break through and grab people's attention when there are wars breaking out around the world and Congress is falling apart, but those things happen all the time. So, if you can grab people's attention for 1,000 to 1,500 words, that's probably the best you're going to be able to do. Often if I have a big idea that I'm trying to tackle, I will break it up into a multiple series of short pieces. That helps both because each piece is able to capture people for a short period of time, and also because nobody is going to read everything that I write. Saying the same thing a couple of different times and putting them out with some time in between increases the likelihood that people will see at least one of the pieces and pick up on the ideas. Repetition is absolutely great when you're talking to a public audience. Don't assume potential readers are already interested in your topic or that they know really anything technical about it. So even if you're going to get into something that's a little bit weedsy, it's really helpful to have an introductory hook that either ties into something current in the news or is something that's very accessible. So you want to assume that people don't know very much, give them a reason to care at the top of the piece, and then pull them in so that they will read farther and get into the details. Writing for policy audience is not like writing a murder mystery. Do not wait until the final chapter to give away who done it. You need to tell them up front. Otherwise, they will simply stop reading and they will never get to the end of this. That's one of the hardest things for academics to remember. They want to walk you through the logic of everything and then tell you the most important piece of the part. You need to reverse that completely for a public audience. When I sit down to start writing a piece, these are 3 questions that I always ask myself. who am I trying to reach? Sometimes there is one specific decision maker, the DC mayor or the chair of the Senate Banking Committee that I have in my head, and I will write to that person. Sometimes it's a general audience, right? I want all suburban homeowners to read this and think about the value of their house. But having a clear sense of who you're writing for, what they know already, what they don't know, what they're interested in, or what would capture their interest is going to help you to reach that audience better. What do you want to achieve? Sometimes it's just flagging, hey, here's an issue people aren't talking about enough that I think is really important, and I want you to sit down and think about it. Sometimes there's an existing debate, and I may offer a new viewpoint or push back against one of the viewpoints that I think is wrong. That's a different kind of writing depending on your goal. There's always a little bit of a tendency to want to tie something in a hook to the immediate news. People are talking about it right now. They're more likely to stop and read this. And that can often get you a bigger audience when it gets posted. But the things that wind up getting more clicks and more reads over a longer period of time tend to be less tied directly to an event in the news. And some of this is also, you can think about cyclical. So I wrote a piece last summer about how higher temperatures during the summer and more heat waves are creating more demands for air conditioning. And that one is going to get clicks every summer when we go through the heat wave because of strategically chosen words in the title. So that when people Google in, what do I do when it's so hot, that they will get led directly to this piece. These are just some technical pieces of advice that we use to write Brookings pieces. Structuring your piece as short sections, each of which has a separate header, phrased as either a question or a key result, helps people scroll through. This is particularly true if people are going to be reading stuff that's web native or reading things on their phone. You want headers that are really going to pop out. Somebody should be able to scroll through your entire piece in about 10 seconds and read just the headers and get the key takeaways. And then they can decide whether they want to dive in, but at least they have the main idea. And seriously, people will scroll through a piece in 10 seconds and then click to something else. So you really want to give them something in that 10 seconds that they can take away. Storytelling with data, we try very hard to create graphics and figures that tell a key part of the story. This is also really important for social media. So you have a nice graphic that's eye-catching, a title that tells you the main takeaway, and then a footnote that tells you enough of the detail that people can understand it without having to get in and read the piece. Again, for academics, you want to lean into things like the lit review, everything that's been done so far in research, the data and the methods. Readers don't care about any of that. They want the takeaways. You can insert something that looks like a lit review with strategically placed hyperlinks. If you look at the top paragraph or so of most of my blog posts, that's what I do, but I never call it a lit review, and it doesn't have lists of author titles and publications. The data and the methods part, if you have to include it, put it as an appendix at the end. Don't assume that people care about that stuff. Most of them only want to know what's the takeaway, what do I do? And everything that you write about that's policy relevant will be political in the sense that there will be people who like it and don't like it. It's essentially impossible to stay away from politics as long as you're talking about human beings. Brookings is nonpartisan. We take that very seriously. We try to avoid commenting on the Republicans are good, the Democrats are bad, or vice versa. And actually, very often the topics that we write about don't break neatly along partisan lines. So the division, for instance, between homeowner interests and renter interests, or transit riders and pedestrians versus drivers, those don't break along party lines. And so you want to focus on the policy issue. It's also very helpful just to be transparent and upfront about any value judgments or priorities that you have. So I think it's really important that we provide support to low-income households, and that high-income households may have to pay more taxes so that low-income households have a decent place to live. And that's something that I'm just going to put out at the front of this. If you disagree with that as a value statement, you're not going to like my recommendations. That's something I can live with, but I'm not hiding the ball on this in any way. And that way people know how to evaluate what you're saying. All right, and that is it for my slides. So I will stop sharing and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Jenny. That was really great. Freddy, take it away, man. Yeah.
All right. Yes, thank you as well. That was really, really great. I was writing some notes in my phone. First, I'd like to just start off with the points going back to like how we communicate. It is very clear that you were putting thoughts together for quite some time and you wanted to talk to a lot of different people. And I think that greatly benefits the work because you've thought about things from different angles. And for the students in the room, hopefully in the question and answer section, we can talk about this a little bit more. It's a tough thing to do, but when you're intentional about it and spend time thinking about it and work on it, eventually you can share some values that really make a difference and have an impact on folks. The point about being like coherent and bringing together a lot of different ideas, I think is really difficult in the housing space because how complex it is and how many things are connected to it. In one way that made me keep reading and enjoying it, especially where there were certain sections where you're talking about things that I've heard over and over before, is that it was captivating because it's authentic and your positionality was clear. So as an engineer, I have to fight back a lot with certain review processes because they're like, this is too much you in it. You're telling us what you think about something and why that matters. And as someone who wants to communicate with a broader audience than just my peer reviewers, I recognize the value in that and fight hard that my voice is still shown, and also the voice of the grad students I work with is still shown, and the voice of the community members that provide me a lot of data from my work is still shown. Made some points about systemic changes at all different levels of government. Housing is one of those ones, again, that trickles down from the federal in certain places, but then also starts at the grassroots in other places. So I thought it was really impactful to think about the culture of housing. And in the beginning of the book, I think there were some really strong points about what housing provides. And I really enjoyed just, even though it was a short section, just reflecting on what housing has provided me and the value of it and thinking about ways that we can push forward, or at least in my own household, in my own community, just appreciating housing for what it is and what we have and why that matters so much as we make decisions about the community and other broader decisions. But skipping that point, I think, is an issue that we do a lot. Sometimes we just get into this thing that we're voting on and don't even, again, position ourselves in what does housing mean to us? What is it providing? Why does it matter? So I think doing that for ourselves is beneficial, but then also putting ourselves in the shoes of others. What is housing providing them? And why do they feel the way that they feel about housing issues can really move things forward? The points about who's paying the costs, I think, go through this book really, really well because of the opaqueness and how difficult some of the economics are, or some of the policy-making structures are, it does get to a point where you're like, hey, I just don't care. I give up. Like, there's no chance to change any of these things. But again, just when we think about how much we are paying, particularly when I think about youth culture, and some of the points you make about children and some of the things that they have to go through from not having adequate housing, again, it makes it all worth it again. So I thought that was really, really powerful and useful. Going into some points about the veto power, I think that slide that you had, and I listened to a lot of the book on Audible, so I missed some of the figures and things like that, some of the images. But that picture you had of like Black Lives Matter, but then pushing against affordable housing in the community is just so true of what we're dealing with, unfortunately. So I think the veto power of community members is a problem to think about, but it's also really important for us to think more about how are we empowering communities that have been underserved and undersupported and just shifting the system overall. I think much more thought can be given to that because so many of these practices and policies were created in clear examples of white supremacist culture, right? So if we keep them, it's clear what we're gonna keep producing. Like, it's just gonna keep being that way. So what are we gonna do that's new, that is more empowering and that can shift things? Sorry, I'm going kind of quick just because a lot of points and I want to do more of the Q&A. Stop building houses in wrong places. As an engineer, it's extremely logical when I look at certain things and just the lack of data that we have. I sit on the advisory board for the American Flood Coalition. They've been doing some really great work in updating our data so that we can make better decisions on where we put housing and infrastructure in general. But you have a point in there that I think I haven't seen enough of And I really like the way that it was highlighted of the devaluing of certain communities. And in particular, I've been doing a lot of work in the Black community and looking at how strategically things have been done. And even as we move new things forward that look good at face value at front, but when you look more of some of the unintended consequences that will occur, it is going to devalue certain Black communities that are in coastal areas or are in high-risk areas. So I thought that was a really important point that we can think about a lot more. The concept of zoning being a sneaky mechanism of pushing inequities or executing injustices is only empowered or mostly empowered by a lack of knowledge and also a lack of opportunity or value in civic engagement. So again, the concept of Black folks, particularly younger Black folks, not voting as much gets thrown around a lot, but you also have to recognize when young Black people vote, sometimes they know that's not going to fix the issue. Now, again, they should still vote because that's part of the process and it is essential, but we still have to do so much more to actually change housing policies or other policies that we're working with within the system. And then lastly, just ending on, again, some of the clear solutions that you line up in the book and are so repetitive on, and the evidence-based practices. I think that's so important because the oppressors and the folks who are really trying to keep the system the way it is, they don't stop. They're consistent. They harp on their main points over and over and over again and are very convincing with them. So again, your suggestions on when you're communicating to broader audiences and trying to make an impact and promote change, calls to actions, being repetitive is effective and important. Don't get the impacts of imposter phenomenon, or don't get the impacts of feeling like, hey, I'm wasting space. Like, no, say it again, and say it again. So that was my first response to the book, and thank you for writing it, and thank you for this platform to engage on it.
Thanks, Freddie. That was great, and I think we're very lucky to have your center here and you at Virginia Tech. So thanks for doing that. And Jenny, we're going to turn it over to Q&A and have people come up, especially the students, I hope. But is there any? And we're going to head more towards a conversation here. But is there any kind of first things you want to say back to Freddie, or responses there?
No, I mean, all of those comments were great. The repetition, one of the things that I've learned actually since coming to Brookings is that you find a phrase that describes something that works and resonates and keep saying it over and over again. So if the chapter titles, build more homes where people want to live, stop building homes in the wrong places. And, people who hear me give the talk more than once, it'll sound really familiar. And that's also intentional because as Freddie pointed out, we have to keep saying the same thing over and over until people hear it and it becomes part of the conversation.
Yeah, question, we're moving to Q&A. So yeah, Ranald has something.
Why don't you go up to the mic?
Yeah, please come up to the mic, and remember that if you want to say something back, to stay at the mic.
Okay. Ranald Adams, PhD student in the STS program. So you mentioned the homeowner's veto, or the heckler's veto, as a lot of folks in local politics call it. It's more than just about housing, though. Land use is more than just housing. It's infrastructure. It's all these other things. Could you speak to some of the other impacts that the heckler's veto and land use has on other policy priorities, whether it be green energy or transit or things like that?
Anything that gets put on land is going to go through some sort of a development process, and often things that get put underneath the land as well. Certainly if you've been following any of the kind of transportation debates, so when a city decides to expand a light rail line or new bus rapid transit, it goes through the same process. We have a bunch of pretty terrible examples of where new public transportation systems have opened. So Los Angeles, where I lived for a number of years, has a pretty new subway and light rail system, and they couldn't build it through connecting some of the really important job corridors from downtown to the west side near UCLA. There's one main street that runs right down LA that connects all of these job hubs. But the residents who lived there were adamantly opposed to having a public transportation system. They were openly worried that poor people who can't afford cars would ride the subway and the commuter rail and would get to their fancy neighborhoods. And so the city couldn't build a connection between these really important job hubs until about 10 years ago. They started with sort of unproductive transit nodes, connecting areas that didn't really make that much sense economically, because that's where there was the least opposition. That's a terrible use of taxpayer money to build a subway line with not high ridership because the community opposes it. And I will say this is a problem that we are really going to have to confront in the clean energy transition, building solar farms, wind farms, new energy transmission lines. All of that has to go through a local permitting process. And so we are already seeing small communities holding up projects with enormous public benefit that we have to do, but we're not able to do them at the size and scale and speed that we need to because of local NIMBYism.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, can I add to that
Yeah,
as well?
please, Freddie.
I'm an energy scholar and look at societal energy literacy, and yeah, that's such a big issue in terms of our transition into green technologies, and not just slowing down projects, but who gets the benefits early of those projects is really critical. Who gets to work on those jobs? Again, who gets the infrastructure first, right? And then moving beyond energy, I think education is a really big issue when it comes to civic engagement at local levels, but also state and national levels of, again, how we move things forward, what services are being provided, what people learn. So yeah, again, housing, I think is a great example of how all these systems are connected and also so personal, right? So you can connect with, like, it all starts at home. Can I be comfortable, feel safe, sheltered, right? Learn some things, be a human being, and then how it connects you to the rest of your community.
Yeah, Sal, please. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Saul Halfon, Department of STS. I really like your talk and the way that you have sort of pulled together all these different aspects of this problem. I want to focus on this question of NIMBY because I think that it's there's a little more sort of complexity in there than what I think you're suggesting. So we like to sort of beat up on NIMBYism because it, particularly when it is invested in wealthy white communities that are kind of protecting their privilege. But NIMBYism also has a very long history. I mean, so Winona LaDuke just came and spoke last week, and she was talking about really the power of local communities in resisting big infrastructure projects like pipelines, which we also, I think, wrestle with a lot in this area. We have a big struggle against a pipeline coming through. And a lot of times these big infrastructure projects are ones that don't help wealthy communities, but help wealthy corporations, right? And it's often poor communities that are, in a sense, saying, not in my backyard, right? And so I just wonder, so I always worry when we focus on NIMBYism too much that we might put in place forms of policy that undermine the ability of local communities to resist what might otherwise be really kind of rapacious infrastructure projects and problems. So I was just wondering, how do you think about that kind of relationship? Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I should say that I went to planning school before I got my PhD. I did a master's in city planning, and the whole planning ethos around community engagement came out of progressive movements in the 1960s and 70s. So both out of the civil rights movement, Black and brown communities were used to being, essentially sort of the federal government coming in, taking over their neighborhood, knocking down homes to build highways into urban neighborhoods, to build commercial projects that had sort of, downtown business interests behind them. So, the sort of Black and brown communities that had been historically ignored, having a voice, having the right to have a voice in large development decisions was one of the impetus behind this. And then, of course, the environmental movement in the 1970s, that we need to think about the environmental impacts of what we do in all communities. And so those were some of the really laudable progressive views behind a community engagement process, slowing down development. The people who live there have a voice in what happens. Obviously, I think those are both still really important, but over time, this emphasis on having a public process, empowering existing residents has really been co-opted by wealthy white communities. And it's astonishing. You can listen to the language of super affluent suburbs saying, we don't want there to be displacement that occurs because of building an apartment building. And sometimes what they're protesting is, we don't want you to build subsidized apartments in our neighborhood because it will cause displacement. It's like, well, if it does, it's displacing rich white people in order to put up apartments for non-wealthy people. And that actually seems like the kind of displacement that maybe we're okay with. So, I hear your point, but I think that where we started from was every community gets a voice and gets to be heard without saying some communities don't have another way to be heard and are overridden, but the people who are mostly winning with this strategy now are people who are going to get heard in other ways, right? And so I think the trick is going to be planners, including like everybody who works in city government and elected officials, need to be more clear about the value statement of which communities they are trying to protect and which communities aren't allowed to hide behind this language in a way to turn themselves into gated communities.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jenny, I just want to add, so I'm in a lot of rooms as the only black man, only young man, I guess, at 31, and I have to think about how the debate's going to go, right? So I get that question a lot. So on page 135, and thank you for having the index, because again, I had a note on the Audible version, and I was able to find it in the text version, which I also got from my library. Shout out to public libraries. You have a section, policies popular with local voters may harm broader regional or national well-being. And you get straight to the point of, in some instances, resident opposition has allowed low-income black and brown communities to fend off harmful projects and displacement. Greenwich Village and Shaker Heights, Ohio are good examples, but citizen voice has also been weaponized by wealthy white communities to block infrastructure projects like public transit, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you have a well-balanced voice here and you're thoughtful about it. But again, I just want to take this as a point of we have to continue to be unapologetic and assertive, because the other side is going to be unapologetic and assertive and say, hey, don't attack this thing. We're just trying to do the right thing. So again, I think it was a really good job. I think it's a great question. It's something that we have to find balance with, but currently we are out of balance, right? The systems that are put in place consistently harm communities. And then what you do a really great job of in this book is talk about the broader picture of when this harm continues to occur, it impacts so many other things that we're not thinking about in the long game, right? People aren't protesting in the streets just because they don't like the color red. They're protesting because people are living in overcrowded spaces. Kids aren't getting the education they need. Water's being poisoned. Food is non-existent, right? These are real problems that when you live in certain communities, you never see.
Yeah. It's almost like a law of our civilization that things that are created to increase democratic participation end up becoming the playthings of moneyed interests and other things. So it happened with our environmental process too. I think we have, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Tritiman, PhD student in the STS department. So we build things. I come from India. Whenever we have a problem, we build foot overbridge. We build overbridge. And what happens next? And after a week, it breaks. So I want to ask you something which Lee Vinsel always talks about is the maintenance of things. So I wanted to ask you about the maintenance of housing. Something I didn't hear you talk about it in your discussion. So I think when housing is in crisis, whatever we have right now is not in great shape, because I have been living in apartments for the past 3 years and things break so quickly. And so I would like to know about your opinion on the maintenance aspect of the current housing and whatever we are going to have in the future. Thank you.
That is a great question, and it's a perfect setup because the short answer is we really don't spend a lot of time talking about maintenance, and we don't spend much time talking about housing quality. Much of the conversation in policy circles is about affordability and supply, meaning expanding supply. But the U.S. housing stock is the oldest it's ever been. The median home is 40 years old, and in a lot of communities, the majority of housing is more than 50 or 60 years old. We have some of the older houses are still in good shape or well maintained. There's sort of a subset that we protect very heavily because they're architecturally desirable. But the truth is, older housing has more maintenance problems. And again, circling back to sort of the environmental views, older homes were built under different building codes. They're not necessarily built for today's climate, both in terms of temperature or water. Older homes tend to have less energy efficient appliances. They may not have insulation. And a lot of them are just not great to live in. So we need to spend more time thinking about what do we do with our older homes? Should we be investing more in not just routine maintenance, but in capital upgrades, in energy efficiency upgrades, and climate hardening? Some of the older homes probably need to be torn down and replaced. And in particular, this is an opportunity where we built stuff that was relatively small because land wasn't that valuable, and land is now more expensive. We can replace lower density housing with higher density housing and increase the total number of homes, also getting newer housing built up to current code standards, but only if we're allowed to do that. And so there's an interesting interaction between maintaining the stock that we want to keep, replacing it when it's time, and replacing it often with more, or in some cases also deciding that we built homes in places people shouldn't be living and we don't want to replace that at all. But this is a really difficult kind of balancing act. And I will say also, some of the newer housing is built to be obsolete pretty quickly. Yep. Builders have decided that I think it's roughly a 20 to 25 year cycle after which the home will be functionally obsolete, and they just anticipate that it's essentially going to fall apart and you're going to have to tear it down and replace it from scratch. And those homes develop maintenance problems really quickly, and you're not going to be able to fix it because it's shoddy materials and shoddy quality construction from the beginning.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much.
I should have been asked that question, so thank you. No, I'm joking. I'm totally joking. Freddie, do you have any takes on maintenance? This is a big passion of mine.
Yeah, as a civil engineer, definitely have a lot of takes on maintenance. Also from like a construction, engineering, and management side, just because the reality is we can't build fast enough. And Jenny, yep, you make some really good points about the majority of housing infrastructure is already there, right? Like the land is already taken up. So focusing on maintenance is critical. I liked your, conversation around like it is not just old versus new, it's good versus bad. It's a quality issue because there is actually a lot of older housing that's really solid. There's a lot of older housing that had better design practices. I can't remember what section of the book it is, but you highlight the concept of having your own bathroom and your own kitchen is relatively new. There were plenty of housing developments that were focused on like shared and more communal existence, a much smaller space for your personal space because you really don't need much. You're not there that much, particularly living in America. You're like working around the clock outside of your house. But even with the transition to like working from home, right? Like how does that design and what does that maintenance need to look like? Because it's really interesting with our environmental issues, the air quality issues that we're looking at now, the water quality issues that we're looking at now are really seeping into the home. So how do we think about that? One unique piece that I guess I'll share quickly that I think is really important for us to consider is what capacity do people have to maintain their home, not only from an affordability point of view, but actual like an understanding of how their home operates. I think we've become extremely illiterate when it comes to understanding the functionality and how a home works. And then the systems become more complex at the same time when we look at the building materials we're using and the systems we're putting in place. So it's just creating a bigger and bigger issue. So like I said before, helping people reflect on what the home means to them, what the value of it is, and giving them a chance to learn more about how to operate and maintain their home is going to be very beneficial.
Awesome. And I'll just self-promote for a second and say I have a little think piece coming out on the role of maintenance and repair in our overall housing crisis, like should be any day. So I'll send it to you and Jenny when it comes out. We're going to have Andrew, who's in the class, ask a question, and then Oliver, Zoom crashed for me on my laptop, so can you come forward after Andrew and ask the questions that are online? Beautiful, thanks. Go for it, Andrew.
Hi, my name is Andrew Rosenthal. I am a first-year master's student in the STS department. And in the seminar today, we kind of discussed alternative models of housing ownership, things like housing co-ops, and your comments about more communal spaces very much ties into this question, which is what place in this problem do things like housing co-ops have, alternative means of home ownership? And also I think this ties in well to the part of the book that talks about wealth generation outside of just homes.
Yeah, that's a great question. At the moment, the US has pretty much a dichotomy where you are a renter with short-term leases and kind of no ownership or control over the space, or you own the space. And there are some kind of areas in between that spectrum. So one of the forms that we have for lower income households to become homeowners and get some of the wealth building is called a limited equity co-op. So those are, but you buy an apartment in a shared building, right? So that's cheaper because you're not buying the entire thing. You also don't have maintenance responsibilities for the whole building, just for your unit. And limited equity co-ops typically have an income limit of people who can buy in. So it's low to moderate income households. And crucially, if and when they resell, you can't just sell it at whatever the market will offer. There's generally a cap either on the price or the amount of the appreciation that you can take. And the idea is that this is a form of homeownership where it's easier for people to get in, it costs less on the down payment, it costs less per month to own, but also you can't make a killing on it. So this is not something where you're going to be able to sell it for 5 times what you bought it for and take away a ton of gains and then go buy another house. Because when you sell, it turns over to another lower income household who has to be able to buy in at an affordable threshold. This isn't a huge chunk of the housing stock. It's mostly in a couple of the expensive cities. So New York has had a variety of local and state programs like this. DC has some limited equity co-ops. It's sort of unclear how big the latent demand is for this. It turns out a lot of people really want the upside potential when they buy a home. And so the idea of buying a home where you're not going to be able to make a ton of money in capital gains isn't that attractive, even for people who have a hard time getting into home ownership. So, I think it should be part of the ecosystem. It's possible that there's more demand than we have seen. Community land trusts are also getting into this space as well, where the trust essentially owns the land and you buy the structure but not the land. So again, brings down the price. So there are a bunch of these things. I suspect they're likely to continue being fairly small. But in my ideal world, we would make just normal renting more stable and more financially attractive. So for instance, people could sign 3 to 5 year leases where you know that your rent is only going to go up by a preset amount or tied to the rate of inflation. That sort of protects people from massive rent increases that wind up pushing them out, gives them some more stability, and allows them to budget a little bit better for longer term things. I would love to see more wealth building that's outside of homeownership altogether. So, for instance, you could imagine a program where renters pay $25 more than their rent every month, and that extra goes into a savings account, which is then portable and goes with them wherever they go, helping them build up some kind of liquid savings that you can tap into. Homeowners really could benefit from having more liquid savings. When you buy a house, and as we were just talking about, things break, things go wrong, you have to pay for the maintenance. And very often, early stage homeowners spend all their money on the down payment, and then they don't have money set aside when they have to fix things and wind up getting into financial trouble that way. So, we've sort of not spent a lot of time on the policy side doing wealth building and savings incentives. And just relying on homeownership to do all of the heavy lifting. And that's clearly not working either for renters or for a lot of homeowners.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate your answer there. I wasn't aware of the models that exist in New York, and I'm probably going to look into those more. It's very interesting.
Thank you. Oliver, come on up and share some questions from the Zoom land.
Yes, Oliver's coming up. I'll quickly just add, Jenny, you have some really interesting points about us looking internationally to some other examples that have been more developed by different countries. And it is difficult to translate, because we have our own policy infrastructure and our own community and culture, et cetera, just in society. But there's a lot of things going on, even outside of the US, that work.
Yeah.
Simply said.
Yeah. Go for it.
So we have 3 questions on Zoom. 2 of them are from one person, but I'll only ask one of them at a time.
Yeah, that sounds good.
So the first question is from Relisa Dawkins, who's asking, zoning laws are embedded in historical and socio-political issues that serve to exacerbate housing inequities, separatism, and racial profiling. Do we need policy reforms or an overhaul of old zoning systems? What would a new housing approach or policy look like from your expertise?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly right that zoning is sort of one layer of a whole set of policies, both in kind of the housing world and in other parts of our life that serve to create and then maintain racial separation. You can think about even things like the way we assign people to go to school, that this is based on spatial assignment based on where you live. So where you live determines where you go to school. Local funding of schools then determines the quality of schools and availability of resources. And so you either win the lottery on all of those dimensions or you lose the lottery. And you know, we have designed a bunch of policies that reinforce one another in the wrong direction. The hard part is figuring out sort of which pieces of that you can change. Policy change is really hard and slow and incremental. And so even things like changing zoning to allow apartments, small apartment buildings in single family neighborhoods, that is an enormous political lift. You know, some of the advocacy groups that I work with have been, you know, for years building momentum and support to make relatively small zoning changes in one city, and it is still an enormous thing to take on. Trying to tackle our zoning policies, our federal regulations around mortgages and who can qualify to buy a home, the way we fund schools and the inequities in school quality, trying to do all of that at once is going to be even harder. And there are groups that are working on inequities in a number of policy domains. There's not as much coordination across policy domains as I'd like to see. You know, the housing people and the schools people and the wealth building people all kind of work on their own separate lanes. So, you know, I would say we should be moving towards more progressive and equitable policies in lots of places where we can, but it also takes a lot of people getting engaged with the system. And, you know, policy change is it's a full-time job. So hopefully some of the students who are involved with this will take this on. But, you know, it's frustrating if you want policies to change quickly because they won't. That said, pushing forward is the only way we're going to get change.
That's an excellent response. Relisa has a second question, but I'm going to go to Kulash, who's an STS graduate student, who asks sort of a short question. I wonder what the effect of Zillow on the market is.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I will say one clear outcome is that people have an idea of what their house is worth because they can look it up on Zillow or Redfin and it tells them your house is worth this much. And that probably isn't all that helpful in sort of transactions and a liquid market of housing, because people will anchor their idea of how much they should get for their house based on what Zillow tells them. And that's, you know, it's a number. Zillow is making a prediction based on the information that it has available. But if Zillow tells you your house is worth $800,000 and you go to list it and the highest bid you get is, you know, $650,000, some people won't take that because they say, well, my house is really worth more. Why won't somebody bid more? And, you know, the truth is that Zillow doesn't have a perfect insight until after the transaction happens. So that part I think is not super helpful. You know, it's also not clear sort of, is Zillow actually encouraging people to look at homes in a different way or to screen out certain kinds of neighborhoods? So the information that Zillow presents about the neighborhood, for instance, things like crime rates or walk scores or school quality, that's information that you could get before, but it's now put in your face. Some of that is probably useful for consumers. Some of it may reinforce kind of perceptions and reputations of neighborhoods in a way that's not helpful, particularly reinforcing sort of, this is a high crime neighborhood, you shouldn't buy into it, when often those statistics can be fairly misleading.
That's great. Why don't we come back to the other one in a bit? Thank you, Oliver. I got a fun question building on that last one for both of you. Where are y'all at with like the role of like short-term rentals and Airbnb and stuff and all this? Because it gets a lot of headlines when it comes to housing issues, but I also heard a housing expert friend say that like the data we have says it's actually not making that huge of a difference in the way markets are working. So where are you all on that question? Jenny, you want to start?
Sure. Nationally, it's not making a big difference, right? I mean, Airbnb and all of the short-term rentals they can have impacts in local markets. So there are a couple of early papers that show in cities that have sort of a lot of seasonal demand for tourism, there's some neighborhoods that do get kind of overwhelmed by short-term rentals. This becomes a very attractive investment option. So people buy a house just to rent it out on Airbnb. And certainly neighborhoods that have a concentration of Airbnbs can become less pleasant for the people who live there. So I'm thinking of like places in Nashville that have become kind of destinations for a lot of bachelorette parties. And then you get, sort of big groups of 20-somethings who are staying around for the weekend. And it's kind of like living with a bunch of college students nearby. So there clearly are some spillover effects locally. Nothing wrong with that. But it's, it's still a really small part of the market. And I will say in some cities, it's clear that they haven't built enough hotels. Airbnbs are a substitute for hotels. And if you limit hotel development, particularly outside of kind of the convention area or the downtown area, people will find other ways to stay. But the solution for that, rather than banning Airbnbs, it's build more hotels.
Nice. Buddy?
Yeah. So half my life I grew up in the Myrtle Beach area. So it's interesting. To think about this for me. But even before I get to that personal point, I went to Seattle in grad school and I wrote a song called Wavy. And it starts off, city life comes with dark days and bright nights. Looking at the skyline, I don't see a sky in sight. I hit the coast just to switch it up. Empty homes everywhere, homeless just sitting stuck, life's a rut. And it was just really difficult to take in as someone going to grad school to work on housing issues, that there's this much housing and this much homelessness in the same place. So when it comes to Airbnb or just temporary housing or rental housing being an issue in certain places, I think we have enough data and we have enough common sense to know that it's a problem and it can be fixed in those areas clearly. But in terms of my personal connection to it being in Myrtle Beach, I also see some positives in regards to, like, I know a lot of Black people in my community can't afford to open a hotel, can't afford to open up even a bed and breakfast, right? But they can afford to use their land as an Airbnb or their home as an Airbnb, and Myrtle Beach doesn't have much economic opportunity outside of tourism. So it allows them to engage in the local market in a different way. So it's split for me there, but overall I think Jenny's point about, like, yeah, there's a hotel issue or there's a hotel business issue of like who gets to engage in that. Also, I think the power of some of these, and I don't want to just pick on Airbnb or any of these companies. Again, I use Airbnb, so if y'all are watching this, appreciate you for allowing me to stay and meet different people, because I like the concept of meeting somebody instead of giving my money to like a big corporation sometimes. Yeah. Is that, like, again, the rules, like how quickly they're able to develop and fix or work on an issue and just make it happen and do it. I think it's really clear about how we can innovate and get something done in a relatively short period of time. But then it goes back to show when we don't think long term in some of those things, that's when so many unintended consequences occur. So yeah, like I really think that if we are intentional, take action quickly, but think long term with the actions we're taking, that's kind of the solution to fixing some of these problems.
Right on. I have another question for you eventually from the class, but we're going to go to a question in the room. Jack,
Yeah.
please introduce yourself too.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Jack Leff. I am also an STS PhD candidate, but I also work at the university as a staff member as the Climate Action Fellow. So these issues are near and dear to my heart. In a roundabout way, I think this question actually follows up from Saul's. I'm sort of curious about some of the challenges that come along with a lot of the sort of YIMBY emphasis on leading with supply and demand focused policies as we live under monopoly capitalism. And I'm sort of thinking about this from both a Blacksburg perspective and a national perspective. I sort of struggle to see how we can sort of move the needle on housing affordability and access when, locally we have the university outstrip the economic potential of the town government or even the county government by anywhere from 10 to 100-fold economic difference and not pay taxes effectively. Same with the foundation. Or nationally, when all the housing is being bought up by companies like BlackRock that just overwhelmingly can outspend anybody else in terms of monopoly capital. So I'm just sort of curious, like, how do we shift the needle if we're not starting with sort of regulating and limiting some of these larger scale institutions from having access to an unregulated housing market?
Yeah, so college towns are a really interesting problem because you do have these very large institutional landowners, many of whom have been around for a long time. They bought up a lot of land, often when there wasn't a ton of competition, certainly for a land grant institution. And they are deep-pocketed. They have very long-term time horizons. So they're not planning for, the next decade. They're planning for like the next 100 years. And they're non-market actors. So they may be sitting on very valuable land that isn't going to get developed because they don't need it, or they don't want to go through the process of selling it and developing it. And they are largely independent of the local government. So that's a particularly difficult problem. And I've talked to folks in Charlottesville, in Chapel Hill, in Madison, in Ithaca. So all of the big college towns, Ann Arbor, they all have similar kinds of problems. There are things that universities could do to be better actors. One is clearly building a lot more student housing to take some of the pressure off of the rental market in the private market, building probably some staff housing, not necessarily for faculty, but for a lot of the staff who don't make that much money but need to live close by. So they could be better stewards with their resources and their land. How you solve the problem of, the university doesn't really have to play ball with the town if they don't want to. That's a structural problem that I don't know how you get around that. And so the town essentially has to accommodate the university, and the university doesn't necessarily have to accommodate the town. And often the university administrators are just not that interested in participating. It's a structural problem that large landowners don't have to pay taxes. In big cities, it's not necessarily universities, but like the federal government owns a lot of the land in DC, and they're not using it the way the district would like to, and there's not much we can do about that. Columbia and NYU have been fighting with New York City government. So these are sort of outside of just the housing and land use realm. How do you think about privileged kinds of institutional entities that aren't subject to the rules that everybody else is? I will push back a little bit on sort of the private market. So institutional investors like BlackRock own a tiny, tiny share of the nation's overall housing stock, right? I mean, starting from 2/3 of the nation's housing stock is owner-occupied. So individual families own 2/3 of the homes. And of the rental stock, the majority of this is owned by smaller landlords, including a lot of families or individuals who own a handful of rental units, right? There are a handful of markets where institutional investors are big enough to move the market, but nationally that is just not what's driving things, and it's kind of become a convenient, sort of a scapegoat for a lot of problems to blame big capitalist institutions. They are responding to the financial incentives that we have created, we the voters have created. If you make housing a scarce commodity that has high returns, investors will want to own it. And the way to get the institutional investors to own less of it is to build a ton more so they have competition, and then they no longer make outsized returns, right? But we, the voters, can't set these rules that incentivize their behavior and then blame them for taking advantage.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then from Relisa or? Okay, yeah, we'll have him here. Yeah, come on.
Hi, my name is Dong Lee, and I'm sort of philosophy guy from the South Korea visiting here. And
go ahead and get into the microphone like you did there for a second. It was beautiful.
All right, so
Yeah.
I'm very happy to hear your valuable opinions, but just want to give some short question that you insist that the building housings where the people want to live is very important, but also I think I guess that make the places where people do not want to live be wanted to live, because I'm from South Korea, actually I said, and there's a very few places in South Korea people want to live. Like I'm from the Seoul, is the capital city of the South Korea, and so every person in the South Korea wants to live in Seoul. So because there's some bunch of people, bunch of companies, that means bunch of the jobs out there. So people who are born in Seoul wants to live in Seoul, and also who are not born in Seoul also wanted to live in Seoul. So so that means that there's so many houses where the people want to live, but the price of the house is very high. Like the size of this room is like over than $100 million or something. Yeah. And so so how about the developing suburban areas or some countryside, the places mostly people doesn't want to live? How do you think about this?
Yeah, so where people want to live is generally driven by their access to jobs. As long as people still have to go into work sometimes, the transportation infrastructure that gets them between where they live and where they work, and then other kinds of amenities. So things like the quality of the public schools, proximity to restaurants and shops or to natural amenities. Some of those are things that we can change with policy, and some of them are harder to change. So I know actually South Korea has tried to move some of the government jobs to outlying cities to kind of spread the economic activity. But it's hard to make a bunch of people go, start up a new city somewhere else and move a bunch of the jobs and companies there. If you don't have the same kinds of amenities and support in the other community, then people don't want to live there, even if it's cheaper. And that's true in the US too. We have cities and metro areas that have been losing population, and housing is cheap there, but people people who live in New York don't necessarily want to move to St. Louis because they don't have their job and they don't have their friends and neighbors and they don't have social supports. And so relocating from an expensive place to a cheap place, if you don't have the other amenities, is hard to do. We also see that there are a lot of people who still live in regions that don't have great economic prospects. A lot of rural areas don't have jobs. They're relatively inexpensive, but people, still they have their social networks and don't want to move someplace else. So trying to relocate people is just really hard.
Hey, Jenny, we have a fire alarm going off in the building, so this is where we're going to end this very wonderful conversation that I really wish to keep going. But thank you so much, and Freddie, thank you, my man.
Thank you, Jenny.
All right, thanks everybody. Jenny, I'll be in touch soon. You were really terrific. Thank you for doing this. Come on.
Hey, that's exciting. That's an exciting way to end.